Can you imagine a YouTuber broadcasting every single step of a murderous rampage before it even happened? The plans, the weapons, the motive, all of it just hidden in plain sight and mostly dismissed as some weird online performance. Today, we're going to break down the deeply unsettling case of how a failed content creator documented his own horrifying descent into a massacre. And that's the thing that's just so chilling about this whole story. This is the central, unbelievable fact. He told the world exactly what he was planning to do, who he was going to kill, where he'd do it, and the weapons he would use. And his small audience, well, they mostly just thought it was all part of the act. But the result was brutally real. 3 of his coworkers were murdered in cold blood before the killer turned the gun on himself. And it left everyone asking the same terrifying question. How did nobody see this coming? Okay, so let's really get into this. How could someone confess to murder over and over and over again on a public platform and nobody stops them? Well, to even begin to wrap our heads around that, we first have to understand the 2 completely different lives he was living. So online, he was Randy Stair of Pioneer Productions. He was this aspiring YouTuber making these, honestly, pretty cringeworthy comedy sketches. But the reality behind the screen, that was a whole different story. We're talking severe depression, absolutely no friends, and a life that he had grown to completely despise. So let's start with that mask that Randy Stair wore for the world. Because before all the darkness took over, he was trying, and while failing, to be a comedian. His channel was really just a portrait of his loneliness. He was almost always by himself in his videos. So much so that to create other characters, he used 2 puppets, a frog and a whale. And his audience? It was small, and it was a mix of people who either mocked him or just found him really, really strange. But underneath all that awkward comedy, especially in his podcasts and live streams, a much darker reality started to seep through. He was basically broadcasting his deep depression and this really profound obsession with death. And this wasn't some character he was playing. It was a desperate cry for help, just disguised as content. All right, so now we're going to peel back that first layer of the mask. We're moving past the failed comedian persona and into the dark obsessions that were, quite literally, consuming him. And the thing is, this didn't just happen overnight. It wasn't some sudden snap. It was a slow, documented slide into darkness. It really started with severe depression when he was a teenager. Then, a friend of his died suddenly in a car accident, and that triggered this intense fixation on mortality. And that morbid curiosity soon found a terrifying focus, the Columbine High School massacre. And this is where his thinking took a really critical, dark turn. He didn't just study Columbine. He revered it. He read their journals, he watched their home videos, and he saw the killers not as monsters, but as idols who had achieved this dark kind of immortality. For a guy who felt like a total failure, mass murder started to look like a way to finally leave a legacy. And this is where the story goes from just being disturbing to being deeply, deeply delusional. We're now diving into the core of his psychosis, an obsession with a fictional cartoon character who he believed was actually commanding him. The character's name was Amber Mcclain. She was a ghost villain from that old Nickelodeon show Danny Phantom. But for Randy, Amber wasn't just a cartoon. Not at all. She became his muse, his goddess, really the absolute center of his fractured reality. And when you hear his own words, you can feel just how real this was to him. He genuinely believed they had a spiritual connection, that she understood his pain in a way that no real person ever had. This fictional character became the most important relationship in his entire life. So this whole obsession, it came to a head with something he called the soul contract. It was this bizarre belief system that twisted all of his inner turmoil into a deadly justification. He believed that if he completed a mission for Amber, he would get to die and be reborn in a ghost world as a woman. This connected his violent urges with his suppressed struggles over his gender identity, and it gave his whole plan this twisted spiritual purpose. And that was it. This was the point of no return. This is where all that delusion and obsession transformed into a concrete, methodical plan for mass murder. And just look at how chillingly logical it all was. First, he picked his target, the supermarket, where he worked a job that he absolutely despised. Then he sealed its fate with a coin toss, which, of course, he filmed for his YouTube channel. He then convinced his own mother to buy 2 shotguns for him. And finally, he started leaving this trail of video clues, meticulously crafting his own dark legacy. There's this quote from his journal that is just absolutely haunting. He's talking directly to his mother, and he acknowledges the role she unknowingly played in his plan. He saw her trust not as love, but as foolishness that basically handed him his path to violence. So we have to ask the big question here. The most disturbing part of this story isn't just what happened. It's how clearly it was allowed to happen. I mean, the warning signs were everywhere. You know, when you really break it down, the failure wasn't just on one person. It was systemic. His family saw his strange behavior, but just didn't grasp the danger. His online followers, his only community, they just wrote off his threats as dark humor. Even his high school had seen glimpses of his violent fantasies and his homework assignments years earlier. And we are not talking about subtle hints here. These were giant, flashing red flags. He was submitting gory, violent stories for English class. He was posting videos posing with his new shotguns on camera. He wore a replica of the t-shirt one of the Columbine killers wore on the day of their attack. The clues weren't just there. They were being proudly displayed for anyone to see. So that brings us to the first really tough question, right? He lived with his family for 24 years. How could they see his obsessive behavior, notice his total isolation, and even buy him the murder weapons without putting all those pieces together? And then you have the online world. In this age where the line between a persona and a person is just so blurry, why did his only community see his clear preparations for violence as just another piece of edgy content? At what point does a performance become a real, credible threat? And really, that leaves all of us with the most important question of all, one that goes way beyond this single tragic case. In our own lives, as we're scrolling through our own feeds, surrounded by countless online personas, could we recognize these signs today? And maybe more importantly, if we did, would we do anything about it?